On September 6, 2006, 51-year-old Susan Kuhnhausen was returning from her job as an emergency room nurse in Portland, Oregon. On the way, she stopped at a hair salon to get her hair dyed. While she waited her turn, she picked up a magazine and a particular quote stood out to her. It said, "I will not live an unlived life. I will not live in fear." At the time, Susan was fighting with her husband Mike. They had been married for nearly 18 years, and their marriage had become toxic, and Susan had finally gotten the courage up to tell Mike she wanted a divorce, and Mike did not want a divorce. And so they had these bitter, awful fights, and Susan was just looking for things to latch onto, and this type of quote gave her motivation to follow through with this very difficult decision. About an hour later, with her hair now a slightly different color brown, she hopped back in her car and drove the last couple of miles home to her quiet little neighborhood. She pulled into the driveway of her one-story Cape Cod home with their gray picket fence around it. She went in the back door into their mudroom, and right away she saw a note next to the microwave that her husband had left, because at this time they were still living together. And the note just said, "Sue, I've had trouble sleeping. I've gone to the beach. I'll see you in a couple of days." She put the note down and then unlocked the door that led into the house, which was into the kitchen. And as soon as the door opened up, she heard the beeping sound of their security alarm. And then she walked all the way through the house to the front door. She unlocked it, went outside, and then checked their mail, and then went back inside the house. After she got back inside and had shut and locked the front door behind her, she kicked off her shoes and then began walking across the house towards the kitchen. She got about halfway there when she looked over to her left, and she noticed the first floor bedroom that they used as a guest room was really dark. And every morning before she left for work, she would open all the curtains around the house. And so in the evening, the sun would come into the house and it would be nice and bright. And so she's thinking to herself, did I forget to open the curtains in that room? Because it shouldn't be that dark. And as she's staring at the room, a man she didn't recognize walked out from behind the bedroom door and started walking towards her. He was medium height, medium build. He had a hat pulled down over his eyes. He had yellow rubber gloves on, and he was holding a hammer. And he began walking right towards her. For many people, the sight of a stranger inside of your home carrying a hammer would be enough to prompt you to turn around and run out of your house, but not Sue. She had been an emergency room nurse for the past 30 years, and in that time, she had done things like crack open people's ribs to massage their hearts, she had administered IVs and thrashing patients that were suffering from withdrawals, and she and the other nurses she worked with trained regularly in self-defense, because you just never knew what was going to happen in the ER. You needed to be ready to slip chokeholds and defend yourself. And so here Sue was, staring down this intruder in her house with 30 years of preparation for this moment. And so Sue ran at this guy faster than he was coming at her, and it caught him off guard. She figured if she could just get up close to him, the power of the hammer strikes would be less. And so she rams into him, and she's about 5'5" and significantly outweighed him. He's about 5'9", maybe 200 pounds. And so she rams him into the wall. He hits her in the head once with the hammer, but it wasn't enough to subdue her or even knock her down. She barely felt it. And so she's holding on to him and she's screaming at him, "Who are you? What do you want?" Because there was a part of her that thought, this is a burglary. I'll just give you what you want. But the guy didn't say anything. And so Susan grabbed him and pushed even harder against the wall. And the man would say 2 words. It was the only 2 words he said the entire time. And it was, "You're strong." And Susan, when she heard that, it was like an adrenaline rush. She knew this guy was not trying to rob her. He was just trying to kill her. And she thought, no, I'm gonna live. And she managed to wrestle the hammer away from him while pinning him against the wall, and then smashed him in the head 3 times with this hammer before he managed to get it back. But when he reached for the hammer, she grabbed his throat and began choking the life out of him. The man immediately went for his throat to get her hand off of him, so he was not trying to attack her. And Susan realized that she had him on the defensive, and she grabbed tighter and tighter around his throat. She moved her other hand up and really started crushing his windpipe. And then she screamed at him, "I'll call an ambulance if you tell me who sent you." And the man looked at her and just grunted at her. And so she continued to squeeze harder and harder until his face turned purple and his eyes rolled back. And she knew as an emergency room nurse, if she continued, she would kill him. And she wasn't really prepared to do that. And so she threw him to the ground. She turned and began to run towards the front door. But this guy jumped up and leapt after her, grabbed her by the ankle and tripped her to the ground. When she landed, she rolled over onto her back, and right on top of her is this guy wielding the hammer, and he's about to bring it down on her. And so she instinctively just shot up. She sat up as fast as she could, and she bit down as hard as she could on the inner part of his upper leg. She bit so hard she tore through the fabric. And the guy screamed out in pain. He couldn't even hit her with the hammer. He began staggering back, at which point she released the bite, got up onto a knee, and then bit him again on the side of his rib cage as hard as she could, once again tearing through the fabric. And so now this guy is howling at the top of his lungs, at which point Sue grabs him and throws him to the ground, but she falls with him and she lands directly behind his back. And he's still trying to grab her, and he's got the hammer and he's trying to hit her. And so she reaches out and puts her arm over his throat and puts him in a wicked chokehold, one that he was not getting out of. And so the guy is trying to fight and get his neck out of the chokehold, but Susan decided that this guy, he's not going to talk, he's not going to tell me what he wants, he's here to kill me, so I'm going to kill him first. And she proceeded to choke him to death. Once he stopped moving, she calmly stood up, looked down, knew he was dead. She grabbed his hammer and then calmly walked out the front door, walked to her neighbor's house, knocked on the door, and then her neighbor comes up and sees Sue just standing there with her clothes tattered and she's all bruised and bloodied, but she looks like she's totally okay. And the neighbor asks Sue, what are you doing? What's going on? Why do you have that hammer? And Sue would tell her that, well, I had an intruder and he tried to kill me, so I killed him, and I need to use your phone to call the police. And so her neighbor's like, okay, come on in and use my phone. And so Sue walks in with her hammer in hand and calmly calls the police and tells them what happened. Police and paramedics show up and they go inside of Sue's house and they confirm that her attacker was in fact dead. And her attacker turned out to be 59-year-old Ed Haffey, who was a Vietnam veteran with a long rap sheet. They discovered Ed's backpack inside of Susan's house, and in it was a notebook that contained instructions for what to do after he killed Susan. And one of those instructions was to call Mike. It turns out this Mike was Susan's husband. He had paid Ed $50,000 to kill his wife. And Mike, earlier in the day, had gone to the house and allowed Ed in and told him where to go and where to wait. And then on his way out, he had written that note saying, I'll see you in a couple of days. When police brought Mike in, he initially denied all charges and said he had nothing to do with this, but he would eventually confess and then would be sentenced to 7 years in prison for soliciting to murder his wife. Although Mike never gave his exact motivations for why he actually did this, he would have been ruined financially during this divorce, but if Susan were to die, he would inherit the house. Immediately after his sentencing, Susan sued Mike for $1 million, claiming she wanted to make sure he didn't have any more money so that he couldn't go hire another hitman to finish the job. Susan didn't have to worry for very long though, because Mike would die shortly thereafter in prison. As for Susan, she never faced any criminal charges and in fact was hailed as a hero in the wake of the attack. Our second and final story is called Dr. Ramsey. In 1978, a 9-year-old girl named Kim was walking to the corner store to get some pasta sauce for her mother. On her walk home, a man she had never met before walks up behind her and speeds up to where he's walking in step with her. And he looks at her and introduces himself and says, "Hi, I'm Dr. Ramsey. I'm a pediatrician. Do you know what a pediatrician is?" And Kim immediately had a bad vibe about this Dr. Ramsey character. There was just something odd about him. The fact that he had approached her so suddenly and was right on top of her. So her reaction was to not answer his questions and instead put her head down and walk even faster because she knows she's almost at her house. She's almost at safety. And if she can just get there, she doesn't have to deal with this strange man. But as she sped up, so too did Dr. Ramsey, staying in step with her, and he begins peppering her with additional questions and comments. "Are your parents looking for a pediatrician for you?" "Of course they are. You're a big girl now. How old are you? What's your name? Your hair is so beautiful. Where do you live?" When Kim got to be about 10 meters away from her house, she just takes off running and she bolts up her back steps through the kitchen door into her house, slams the door behind her, and for a few seconds she just stands there, almost anticipating hearing this Dr. Ramsey guy come up the back steps behind her. But he doesn't, and after a couple of minutes, she pokes her head around and looks out the window, and he's not there anymore, and she feels completely relieved that that weird guy is now gone and she can just forget about it. But it turns out she couldn't just forget about this because Dr. Ramsey was not going away anytime soon. It wasn't long after this first initial interaction with Dr. Ramsey that Kim was home one day and she happened to be looking out her front window to the road and she sees a blue Ford Galaxy drive slowly by their property. And she's looking at the car and she can tell immediately that the person driving it is Dr. Ramsey. But Dr. Ramsey doesn't see her. She's kind of obscured behind curtains on the window, and she's watching him, and he was looking at their front door and he was waving as if there was someone standing on their front steps, but Kim knew there wasn't. And so he bizarrely just drove the rest of the way past their property, waving the whole time, and then drove off. Now at this point, Kim has not told her mom or her dad or her siblings about Dr. Ramsey, because that first interaction, she kind of chalked it up to maybe her being paranoid and maybe even being a little bit rude that she ran away from this doctor who was just trying to talk to her. But now that she's seen him drive past her house and he's acting strange, her alarm bells are starting to go off. But she doesn't tell her parents quite yet. But the next day when Kim was playing outside, a car drove by and she turned to look at it, and it was the blue Ford Galaxy, and who was driving? Dr. Ramsey. And he slows down and he waves to her and he smiles at her as he passes by, and she kind of looks at him like, what are you doing? At this point, Kim knows he's acting inappropriately. Whatever his angle is, it just didn't feel right. So she runs inside and she explains to her mom that when she went to the store to get that pasta sauce on her way back, this strange man, Dr. Ramsey, approached her. She came back to the house. Now I've seen him twice outside of our property and he's clearly waving at me. There's something wrong with this guy. Kim's mother reacted to this news the way most of us would, which is, you're talking about a doctor in this nice neighborhood who's driving down the road saying hi to my kid, and he claims he's a pediatrician. Like, that's a child's doctor. It makes sense he might be waving to kids. That's part of his job, talking and interacting with kids. And so her mother says this can't be a big deal. I'm sure he just works in the area and this is part of his commute going down this road, and now you've seen him a couple days in a row. It's just a coincidence. But shortly after this, when Dr. Ramsey started calling their house, Kim's mother and father very quickly ditched the "he's a doctor so we can trust him" routine and became very concerned. A couple of days after Kim had told her mother about Dr. Ramsey, Kim gets called into the living room where her father's sitting, and he looks very troubled, and he calls her over and has her sit down, and he says, "You're not in trouble. I just need you to talk me through exactly what happened when Dr. Ramsey approached you. Your mother told me about it, and there's been a couple weird things that have happened here, and I just gotta hear the story from you." And so Kim goes through the story. She describes how she was leaving the store. He just kind of showed up, and Kim did not talk to him. She put her head down and basically ran back to the house, and that was it. Kim's father reacts to this like he's totally perplexed about something, that he's hearing the facts, but they don't make any sense. And he says to Kim, "Are you sure you didn't say anything to him?" And Kim said, "No, I was scared. I didn't say anything." And Kim's father's like, "Then how did he know your name?" Kim was like, "What do you mean?" And her father said, "Well, just the other day, I got a phone call from someone saying they were Dr. Ramsey, and they asked to speak with you, Kim, by name. They said, 'Can I speak to Kim?' And I thought that was odd because, you're my child." And I said, "Well, why do you need to speak to my daughter? Why can't you speak to me? I'm her father. You're a doctor, you can speak to me." And they hung up. And then they called back again, and they asked for you by name again, as if they hadn't heard me the first time. And so I said again, "Why do you need to talk to my daughter? You can just talk to me, I'm her parent." At which time they hung up again. And so I wanted to hear from you directly if you had given your name to him, because the fact that he knew your name on that call seems really odd to me. Kim assured her father that she did not give him her name. And you got to remember that this is back in 1978, so Dr. Ramsey would not have been able to use the internet to try to find Kim's name, nor would Kim's name have been listed in a telephone book because she was a minor. It would have been her father or her mother that was listed in the telephone book. So in order for Dr. Ramsey to have her name, he would need to know someone that would give up her name or do some digging, which is obviously very creepy considering the fact that Kim has never met him before. He's a strange older man and she's a 9-year-old girl. So with that in mind, Kim and her parents are on edge about this Dr. Ramsey character, but they don't have any clear recourse because he didn't do anything that was criminal. They couldn't go to the police and say he figured out our daughter's name, because they would be saying a doctor, a pediatrician no less, knows our child's name and was waving and smiling at her. But shortly after this, Dr. Ramsey's behavior would take a dark turn. He would call Kim's house again just a couple of days after those first 2 calls, and Kim's father would answer, and right away, Dr. Ramsey says, "I need to talk to Kim." And Kim's father goes into protective mode, and he says, "Do not call this house again," and he hangs up. But seconds later, the phone is ringing again, and at this point, the family has come in the room because they heard their father screaming at someone on the phone. The phone's ringing, and their father picks the phone up and puts it back in the receiver, canceling the call. And he looks at his family and he says, "Do not answer the phone." The phone rings again. He picks it up and cancels it again. On and on, the phone rang incessantly all night until they disconnected the phone line. The next day, when they plugged the phones back in, Kim's parents told all of the kids, "Do not answer the phone. No matter what, don't answer the phone." And once again, the phone starts ringing, and Kim's father picks it up. He doesn't say anything, and he hears on the other end of the line, Dr. Ramsey asking for Kim. And he says, "Do not call this house again," and he slams it, thinking that's going to do it, but of course it doesn't. And over the next several days, anytime the phone was plugged in, it was practically a non-stop call from Dr. Ramsey. And one time when Kim's father did pick up the phone, he reacted to it like it was some horrible thing being told to him, and he put it down, he disconnected the phone, and he went into the kitchen. And one of Kim's brothers overhears their father talking to their mother in a hushed tone, and he's saying to her, "He just told me he's gonna hurt Kim unless he can speak to her." After this threat was made, things got very complicated. Back in the 1970s, there weren't any stalking laws that would protect Kim and her family from Dr. Ramsey. Even though Dr. Ramsey had just threatened Kim, there was no proof he had done that, and he hadn't done anything physical, and so there wasn't any legal recourse. The police couldn't really do anything. And so Kim's father ends up calling one of his friends who happens to be a police officer. He explains the situation, and he says, "Would you mind for the next little bit just escorting my daughter Kim to and from school, because we don't want her to be out walking around by herself with this guy rolling around the neighborhood." The friend says yes, and he began bringing Kim to and from school, and Kim felt a lot safer with her father's friend because you have this police officer that's walking around with you. But it also isolated Kim in a really major way. She wasn't really allowed to go outside anymore without an escort, which meant her life was confined largely to being inside almost 24/7, and there was no clear resolution in sight for how to handle Dr. Ramsey, and so it was like this indefinite period of time that Kim was just not going to be allowed to have a normal life. Once Dr. Ramsey was completely cut off from any interaction with Kim, I mean, she barely went outside, and when she did, she was with this police escort, and she never answered the phone. Once that was going on, Dr. Ramsey became desperate. One evening, Kim, her sister, two of her brothers, and her mother were in the kitchen chatting when one of her brothers suddenly reacts like he sees something out the back window that leads out to their garage. And he runs over and he's looking out, and Kim and her family are turning to him saying, "What do you see? What's going on?" And he goes, "There's someone in the garage." And they all run to the windows and they're looking out, and there's a window on the side of their garage. Their garage was detached from their house. And there's a window on the side, and there was this man there standing there looking out at them. And once he saw that everybody is looking at him, he ducked his head down. And as Kim's family is looking at each other like, did we really just see someone in the window? Because it's kind of dark and they're not there anymore. Suddenly, the garage door slowly rises up, and out pops a man who stands up, looks at them just long enough that Kim yells, "That's Dr. Ramsey, I saw him, that's Dr. Ramsey." And then the guy takes off down the driveway away from their house. And Kim's two brothers immediately run out the house and chase him down the road, but eventually he darts into another property and he disappears and they can't find him. Kim's mother calls the police, they show up, they take down some statements, and they basically say, "Look, if he comes back, let us know, but for now, just go back in your house and lock the doors and keep an eye out." For 2 weeks after the garage incident, they didn't hear from Dr. Ramsey and they didn't see Dr. Ramsey, and it was this great reprieve from this very stressful time in their lives. But after those 2 weeks, Kim's father walked outside onto their front porch and he saw their beloved German Shepherd was dead lying off the side of the porch. And he goes over to the dog and it looks like it's been roughed up, but it's hard to tell what actually happened to it. Now, at first, the family is absolutely devastated about the loss of their beloved animal. But shortly after that, they start thinking, do you think Dr. Ramsey could have had something to do with the death of our dog? And so Kim's father calls the police and says, "I think our stalker, Dr. Ramsey, killed our dog." But the police would say there was no evidence to suggest anybody killed your dog. It could have just been an accident. Also, we haven't even been able to identify who this Dr. Ramsey person is because there are no Dr. Ramseys in this town. And so probably he's using a fake name. So the family's sad and frustrated, but once again has nothing they can do about this. That night, Kim and her family are sitting at home. They're all very sad about the loss of their dog, and the phone rings. Now, prior to this, there had been 2 weeks where Dr. Ramsey hadn't called once. And so Kim's father picks the phone up and says, "Hello?" And it's Dr. Ramsey. But unlike all the other calls where Dr. Ramsey almost always began with, "Put Kim on the phone," this time he started with, "There are 7 people in your house right now. Your wife's in the kitchen, you're in the living room, your 3 sons are watching TV in the den, and your 2 daughters are upstairs in their respective bedrooms." Kim's father is obviously horrified to hear this because it was all accurate, and he just screams into the phone, "Stay away from my family," and he hangs up. After this phone call, Kim's father was naturally very shaken up by this because even though they knew Dr. Ramsey was probably living in the area, and he clearly drove past the property and was local, it just felt way more intimate for him to be naming things that meant he had to have been near their house recently and looking in windows. And so Kim's father runs around the house and makes sure all windows are shut and locked, blinds drawn, all the doors are locked, and then he goes all around the house to make sure all his kids and his wife and everybody's okay. And then afterwards, he considered calling the police, but felt like it was kind of futile because to this point, they haven't been able to help them and nothing has changed. It was just another creepy phone call. And so they don't do anything. The next day, they plugged their phone line back in because they need to use a phone, and shortly thereafter, the daily calls with Dr. Ramsey began again. And now, every call, whenever they did pick up, started with Dr. Ramsey identifying who was in the house and where they were. After a couple of days of this, the family was just living in paranoia. It was this horrible time in their lives. And one night, the phone rings and Kim's father picks it up, ready to just scream at this guy and take out his frustrations. And Dr. Ramsey, instead of giving the report, starts by saying, "I can open your kitchen window and I can open your French doors to the side of your house." Kim's father is about to yell at him, but instead just hangs the phone up and runs into the kitchen, and he checks the window and he knows it's faulty. And clearly, so does Dr. Ramsey. And so he gets a piece of twine and he ties it over the latch and gets it as tight as he can. And then he ran over to the French doors, which were faulty. You'd have to push pretty hard, but you could, in theory, pop the doors open if you knew these were faulty doors. And so Kim's father is not taking any chances, and he gets some nails out of the junk drawer and he nails a row of nails into the ground, right into the hardwood, sitting immediately outside the frame of the door. So if you were to push on them, you would just butt up against the heads of these nails and it would keep it shut. It was his temporary solution until he ordered a proper lock to fit on the door. At this point, it was safe to say Kim and her family were living in fear that Dr. Ramsey at any given point could just break into their house, because clearly he was canvassing their house and testing different entry points, and he had already found 2. And so now they just felt totally unsafe in their house. But oddly enough, after that last call where Dr. Ramsey had said he knew the kitchen and the doors were faulty, the calls from Dr. Ramsey decreased to almost 0, and they didn't see him anywhere, and it started to feel like maybe he had gotten his thrills and he was moving on now. And it just so happened that around the time the family is starting to think this could be over, the mother and father had to go to this company function where the kids couldn't go. So the kids would be alone, but the kids said, you know, we're fine with it. We have each other. The house will be locked. We won't go anywhere. And the parents, even though they hated the idea of their kids being alone at all because of everything going on with Dr. Ramsey, they felt like, you know what, it does seem like he's kind of moved on and we're only going to be gone for a couple of hours, so I'm sure this is going to be fine. So that night, after her parents leave, Kim is sitting on the couch, she's watching TV, her younger brother is laying on the ground right in front of her, and her sister is sitting on the other end of the couch and she's on the phone. And Kim said she found herself looking out of her room into the kitchen towards the side of the house where those French doors were that led out into the side yard, and those doors were still only secured by the nails her father had put into the ground. The lock her father had ordered had not come in yet. Kim found herself looking at these doors, feeling really uneasy about it, and then as she was looking at it, she could have sworn she saw the doors begin to push open. And she's looking at it even more closely, and then for sure, she sees the doors bow inward like someone is pushing on the top and the nails are stopping the bottom. And for a split second, she sees the clear silhouette of Dr. Ramsey. And she screams, it wakes up her sister and her brother, and she's pointing at the double doors. They all look, and once again, he pushes on those doors, exposing himself just for a second to the kids. So now all 3 kids have now seen this guy trying to force his way into their house, and so they scream and run right upstairs. They go into Kim's room, they shut the door, lock it, turn the lights off, and they go over to the window that's looking out to the front of their house. Now, Dr. Ramsey is on the side of the house, so they wouldn't be able to see him through this window, but they're just praying that he does not break through those doors and come in the house. They're hoping they'll see him as he exits the front of their house. And they're kind of keeping an eye out the window, just praying they see this guy leave their property and leave them alone. But they don't see him leave, and they don't hear any noise downstairs or outside. It's just total silence. And they're wondering, did he already get in the house? They decide they need to look for themselves. And so they leave Kim's room and they sneak down the hall to the side room, which was their brother's room, that overlooked the area where Dr. Ramsey would be. They go over to the window and they poke their heads up and look out the window downstairs. And sure enough, there's a man standing right in front of those French doors with his hands on them, kind of looking in, looking around. And at this point, the kids suck themselves down underneath the window so that he doesn't see them. And as they're crouched down, they hear him start banging on the door downstairs, at which point Kim's sister, who was there with her, just says, "What do you want?" The banging stops and the man says, "I have a pizza, come down and get it." Kim and her siblings didn't order a pizza, so they just yell out, "If you don't leave, we're gonna call the cops." And then Kim pokes her head over the window and she looks down and she can clearly see it's Dr. Ramsey, who's now turned and he's running away from their house. Just a couple of minutes later, Kim's two older brothers return. They were out at a skating rink and they come back, they come inside, and Kim and her two younger siblings go up and tell them what happened. And immediately those two run out and start looking for him, but he's long gone by now. So they come back in, they shut all the doors, they lock everything, they shut the blinds, and they say, okay, all we can do is just get a knife out of the kitchen, each of us, and just be armed until our parents come back. So they all grab a knife except for the youngest brother, and they all retreated to their rooms and basically just waited for their parents to come home. An hour later, Kim's parents are still gone and all the kids are still in their rooms, and her younger brother gets hungry and he decides to go down to the kitchen to get a bowl of cereal. So he goes downstairs and he's getting his cereal together and he starts feeling like someone is watching him. And he's looking around and he knows all the curtains have been drawn and everything's locked and shut and he's just psyching himself out, but he notices the French doors that are leading to the side of the house. Those have glass panes on them and there's nothing covering them. And so as he's getting his cereal together, he finds himself constantly looking over at this door. And finally he decides, okay, I'm gonna put my cereal down and just go look out the glass, just make sure no one's there. And so he walks a little bit closer to these doors and he gets about, 5-6 feet away, and the glare from the lights above still make it impossible to look out this glass. And so he's kind of squinting his eyes, but he can't see anything. And so he steps forward and he puts his hands like this and he looks right out one of the panes of glass. And staring back at him is Dr. Ramsey, who's probably been there the whole time. And he's just standing there looking at him. And he freaks out, he screams for his brothers, and as soon as he turns back around, Dr. Ramsey has run away, he's gone. All of the siblings come pouring downstairs, knives in hand, and they're asking what's going on, and the youngest brother is trying to explain that he just saw Dr. Ramsey right on the other side of this door, and the older brothers go running outside, they're screaming for this guy, they're looking for him, but he's gone, and they all come back in the house, and they don't know what to do, and so they all stay up together in the kitchen with their knives, with everything shut and locked, just waiting for their parents to come back. And shortly after they hear their parents using their keys to come in the house, they come in and the kids explain what happened to their parents, and the parents feel horrible. And they're like, I'm so sorry that we left. We should never have left you guys. But as horrible as this was for the family, when they call the police, they can't really do anything because he wasn't there now. Nobody got hurt. Nothing was taken. And they don't even know what this guy's name is. And so they just said, stay inside, keep everything locked, and let us know if he comes back. A couple of horrible weeks for this family goes by where they're living in constant fear. The parents are never away from their kids. The father had to take time off from work. It's just this very stressful time where they are totally prisoners in their own home. And after about 2 weeks of this, Kim is at school. She's at recess with her class outside. And she was playing on the playground when she looks out at the road and she sees Dr. Ramsey in his car parked, waving at her and yelling her name. And so Kim is horrified. She turns and runs to her teacher and she points at him and she says, that guy's stalking our family. I have to go inside and tell my parents. They immediately took this very seriously. They took Kim inside to the principal's office and they called home to Kim's mom. And when she picks up, Kim's mom explains that she just got a call from the school office asking her to verify whether her husband was going to be picking up Kim from school early. And Kim's mom said, no, he's not picking her up. There's no one picking her up early. And that's when they put it together that Dr. Ramsey must have been in touch with the school to try to convince them that he was Kim's father and he was here to pick her up, and that's why he was parked outside. Kim's mother is horrified because she's thinking to herself, if the school hadn't been diligent to confirm this, there's a chance they would have given her child to Dr. Ramsey. This proved to be kind of like the final straw. Even though there was a whole bunch of final straws along the way, this was the one that ultimately pushed Kim's father over the edge. That night, Kim was sleeping in bed when she woke up because she was thirsty, and she goes downstairs to the kitchen, and she's surprised to find her father is sitting at the kitchen table, the lights are off, and he's got a gun in front of him, and he looks totally disheveled and upset. And she knows right away that this is because of Dr. Ramsey. She's not thinking this is anything else. And so she walks over to the sink and just kind of ignores the fact that this is happening. She gets a sip of water, and then she sits down with her father and says, is everything okay? And her father looks up and he just says, no, I'm not okay. I'm tired of leaving the house and wondering if when I come home, my family's not going to be there anymore. I'm tired of not being able to protect my own kids. I'm tired of this. This has to end. Kim didn't know what to say, so she just sat there in silence with her father until he told her to go back to bed. Kim says after this night, they never heard from Dr. Ramsey again. It was like he vanished off the face of the earth. No more phone calls, no more drive-bys, no more anything. He was just gone. And while we don't know for sure what happened to Dr. Ramsey, I think it's safe to assume that Kim's father had something to do with it. As a young man, Greg had worked as a chief engineer on ocean-going vessels, spending months out at sea. But in his middle age, he had reinvented himself as a landman. It was Greg's job to secure leases of mineral rights and land for drilling. Greg was slender and fit-looking despite the fact that he never exercised and he smoked constantly. He kept a close-cropped white beard and he had the leathered skin of a lifelong outdoorsman. Every Monday morning, Greg would make the 2-hour commute in his pickup truck from Lafayette, Louisiana, all the way to Beaumont, Texas, where his company would always rent him a room. The hotel itself was neither good nor bad, but to Greg, he didn't care. He just needed a bed and a TV. Once Greg walked inside, he had a bathroom immediately to his right, and then a little bit farther in was the main section of the hotel room, which was very basic. You know, straight ahead, there was a window that looked down onto a small pool that was lined with potted plants. And then in the main space was a queen-size bed tucked up against the right wall, and then on the left wall was a TV. Greg wheeled his one suitcase into the hotel room and he put it at the foot of the bed and he opened it up. He pulled out the shirts that he wanted to keep wrinkle-free for the week and he hung them in his closet. Then he pulled out his toiletries that were kept in a cloth bag with a hook and he hooked those onto a towel rack. Then he took off his very worn brown boots and his faded blue jeans and he slipped on some pajama pants. Anytime Greg stayed at the Elegante, he rarely left his room. There was a bar downstairs, but he wasn't a big drinker or socializer. He preferred to just have quiet nights alone in his room watching TV. So that night, Greg cranked the air conditioning to make sure it was as cold as it could get. He liked to sleep in a very cold room. And then he hopped on his bed and he put 2 big pillows behind his head and he rested up against the headboard. And then he took a towel and he laid it out next to him. And on the towel was his ashtray, his cigarettes, his lighter, his phone, the TV remote, and a candy bar. Then he picked up the TV remote, turned it on, flicked through the channels until he landed on one that was playing Iron Man 2, and he thought, good enough. Put the remote down, picked up his candy bar, opened it up, he ate a piece of his candy, and then he grabbed a cigarette, lit up a cigarette, and he began smoking. The following morning, Susie, Greg's wife, did not get a call from her husband, and he always called her every morning that he was gone. That was their routine, and this was a big break from their routine. And so she tried calling him, and his phone rang and rang and rang, and he never picked up. And so then she called his Beaumont office, and he didn't pick up. But after the second or third time she called, his coworkers picked up the phone, and they said, hey, you know, Greg's not here. He hasn't come into work yet. And Susie felt concerned. She felt like something was wrong. And she said, do you guys mind just going to his hotel room and knocking on his door and making sure he's okay? And they said, sure, we'll go over there. So the 2 coworkers head over to the hotel. They knock on Greg's door. He doesn't answer. And so they go down and get the manager, who comes up and opens Greg's door, and right away they find Greg lying dead in the middle of his hotel room. The way Greg was positioned when they found him, it looked like he had fallen to his knees and then fallen again onto his face, and his left arm got kind of tucked underneath his body, and still in his 2 left fingers was a cigarette that had not fallen from his hand that had burned down to the wick. The room was exceptionally warm and Greg's skin was grayish blue. Immediately after seeing Greg, the 2 coworkers called 911. Shortly after the ambulance arrived at the hotel, Detective Scott Apple arrived in his cruiser. Apple was a short guy, very, very fit. He had silver hair that he spiked up. He looked 100% cop, and he worked basically 24/7. When he got up to room 348, there was no sign of a break-in, nothing had been disturbed inside of the room, and there was no blood or obvious wound on Greg, with the exception of a slight abrasion on his cheek when he came down and hit his face on the rug. He looked around the room and he found Greg's wallet that was sitting in the back pocket of his jeans, and there was hundreds of dollars in his wallet that had not been taken, so he ruled out robbery. He went out into the hall and he began interviewing the other occupants of the surrounding rooms, and no one had heard anything and no one had seen anything. He went back into the hotel room and he began looking around for drugs of any kind or any substance that Greg might have taken that could have contributed to his death, and there was nothing. No prescription pills, no alcohol, nothing. Later that day, after the family had been notified of Greg's passing, his grief-stricken wife, Susie, called Detective Apple, and she said, you know, my husband did not take good care of himself. He had a terrible diet. He's been smoking like a chimney since he was a young teenager, and he never saw a doctor. And I always told him that if he wasn't careful, something like this was going to happen. I always worried that he might have a heart attack or something. So at this point, not only does Greg's family think he died of natural causes, Detective Apple also thinks the same thing. He's thinking about what he saw in the hotel room, and there's no sign of any foul play. It just looks like a guy whose lifestyle caught up to him. Greg's body was sent to Dr. Tommy Brown, who in Beaumont, Texas, he was like the medical examiner. He'd been doing this for years and years. Dr. Brown had read ahead that they believed Greg had died of a heart attack or something like that. And when his body was wheeled in front of him, there was nothing he saw right away that contradicted that theory. The only two marks that the doctor noted on the outside of Greg's body was the small abrasion on his face from where he landed on the rug, and then he also had another small abrasion on his crotch. But beyond that, the rest of his body was completely unblemished. When he looked inside of his body, it looked like someone had literally just crushed his insides. His torso was full of blood. Food from his intestines had been ripped outside. He had ribs broken, internal organs were lacerated, and there was a hole in his heart. Dr. Brown was really confused at what he was looking at, because the severity of Greg's internal injuries were more consistent with someone who had been in a severe car crash or who had had a really heavy object land on them. But Greg didn't have any significant external injuries that would support either of those two things happening to him. And he was found in the middle of a hotel room where there was nothing disturbed and no one had apparently seen or heard anything. And so Dr. Brown says, look, I don't have all the answers here, but this was not natural. This is a homicide. And my best guess is he was beaten to death. I know it doesn't really make sense because there's not any external injuries, but he suffered some significant trauma from somebody else, and that's what killed him. When Detective Apple got this report from the medical examiner, he was just as confused as Dr. Brown was, but his attention turned to, okay, well, if he's been murdered, who would want to murder him? And he began digging into Greg's background, and he found that he was universally liked. He was known for being incredibly courteous and polite. He kept to himself. He was in love with his wife, and his wife loved him back. There was no evidence of some scandal in the background. He was just this really nice, normal guy, and it didn't make any sense why anybody would want to kill him. After a few months of getting nowhere, and in reality, he hadn't really even gotten started because there wasn't any good starting point. The only thing he could find that was odd about the crime scene was that the room was particularly warm when they walked inside, which was not in keeping with how Greg would have kept the room. But that doesn't explain why his insides were crushed. And so he's gotten nowhere, and then he makes a discovery. He found in the hotel's maintenance logs on the night Greg died, he had been making popcorn in his microwave and managed to blow a fuse. And it wasn't just his power. Maybe Greg didn't know this, but he cut the power to both the room next to him on his right and on his left and below him. And so he calls down to the front desk, and a maintenance guy came up and he reset the breaker. This opened the door to two theories. The first theory is the maintenance guy, who did have a criminal record, when he came up to fix the breaker, he attacked Greg. But that was wildly speculative, and there was no evidence to suggest that the maintenance guy would do that, and so that was quickly ruled out. The other theory was Greg's neighbors in room 349 were these two electricians who were big partiers and drinkers, and so Detective Apple suggested that maybe when Greg accidentally cut the power to their room, they were really annoyed, and they went outside in the hall, and they saw Greg, and they somehow realized he was to blame for this, and in a drunken rage, they attacked him and killed him, and that's what killed Greg. And even though it was a stretch, it was the closest thing to a motive Detective Apple had found in anyone. And so Detective Apple put on a hidden camera, and he went and interviewed these two electricians that were still staying in room 349. And he said when he spoke to them, they were very forthcoming. They seemed very honest. They were appropriately curious about what happened to Greg. And all they said was, look, we had no interaction with him. We did hear him coughing when we came back from the bar. We were at the bar that night, but honestly, that's the extent of our interaction with him. The electricians offered up their cell phone numbers, their email addresses, and said, anything you need from us, we'd be happy to help. We're really sorry this happened. At this point, Detective Apple is back to square one. No one knows what happened to this guy. The one big lead he had, the maintenance records, proved to be a total dead end. And so unfortunately, this case went cold. 7 months after Greg's death, where there had been absolutely no traction on figuring out what happened to him, Susie, Greg's wife, decided she wanted to hire a private investigator. And her friend suggested she call Ken Brennan, who was a famous private detective who was well known for being able to solve really complex cases. And so on a whim, Susie calls Ken Brennan, not expecting to get through to him, thinking he's probably super busy and has other cases because he's on TV and he's this really famous guy. But he picked up the phone and he was like, hey, how can I help you? And Susie couldn't believe it. She had a chance to tell him about what happened to her husband. And Ken said he was really interested and that he would take on the case. Ken was a former Long Island cop, and he was a DEA special agent. He spoke with a really thick New York City accent, and he wore t-shirts that were a little bit too small to show off his muscles, and he usually had a big, gaudy gold chain on. Once Ken agreed to take on this case, he flew right to Lafayette, Louisiana, where Susie lived, and he sat down and he asked her a lot of really difficult questions about their marriage, about whether she thought he might be cheating on her, if he had like a secret life she didn't know about. And after feeling satisfied that all those avenues have been explored and were not going to lead to the answer, he said, okay, well, can you tell me anything about the crime scene that stood out to you? Is there anything about it that seems off? And Susie said, yeah, Greg always kept the air conditioning on very cold at night. He never slept in a room that wasn't freezing cold. And so I thought it was really odd when his coworkers discovered him that the air conditioning was off and it was really hot inside of the room. That's incredibly unlike Greg for his air conditioning to be off. Ken made a note of this, and then he left Lafayette and he went to Beaumont, Texas to meet up with Detective Apple. And Detective Apple and he actually got along really well. They agreed to work together on this case because Detective Apple feels like he's reached a dead end anyways. Apple brought Ken to the crime scene. He showed him the hotel room. And then afterwards, he turned over all of the documents he had on the case, from the autopsy report to the photographs to anything he'd collected over the 7 months he'd been working on it. So that night, Ken diligently looks through all of the documentation, all of the photos. And the next day, when he goes into Apple's office, he says to him, I think I figured it out. And Apple's like, oh, really? You figured it out one day after being here? And Ken's like, no, seriously, I think I figured it out. I have to confirm something with his wife, but I think I have a theory. And so Ken calls Susie right in front of Apple. And when Susie picks up, Ken's like, hey, did your husband ever smoke with his left hand or did he smoke with his right hand? And Susie said, oh no, he only smoked with his right hand. And Ken goes, thank you very much. He hangs up and he goes, Apple, I got it. And so Apple's like, okay, what's your theory? And Ken says, okay. So I spoke to Susie and she told me it was very strange that his room was not air conditioned when they discovered his body, because Greg was known for always turning on the air conditioning to as cold as it can get, especially at night when he went to bed. And so when his power went out the night before, his air conditioning would have gone out. And so the maintenance guy comes up, turns the power back on, but it doesn't trigger the air conditioning to turn back on. The room is still cold from having been air conditioned all evening to that point. And so the TV is back on, and so perhaps Greg turns and just starts watching TV. Because the room feels air conditioned, he hasn't realized that he hasn't turned the air conditioning back on again. Now, this is Beaumont in the summer, so it's going to get really hot in his room really quickly. And as soon as it starts to warm up in there, he's going to realize, oh, I didn't turn the AC back on, and he would go over and turn it on again. And so because the air conditioning wasn't on, and we know that the power was restored at 8:30, then he must have died after the power was on, but before it got warm enough in the room for him to recognize he did not turn the AC on, which means he would have died somewhere between 8:30 and 9 p.m. at night. And so Apple's like, wow, that's pretty impressive, except that doesn't really help us figure out how he died or who killed him. And Ken puts his hand up and he says, I know, I'm just building the whole picture here. Okay, so we have him dying between 8:30 and 9, and I don't think he was beaten to death. I think a lot of people want that to be what killed him because it's kind of the only thing that might make sense, but I say it definitely doesn't make sense because of the cigarette. Now, we found that cigarette in his left hand, and I talked to his wife, and she said he only smokes in his right hand. And so what I think happened is the power came back on at about 8:30, which is what the report says. The TV turns back on. Greg doesn't turn the air conditioning back on. He sits on his bed. He's watching TV. He lights up a cigarette, and he's smoking with his right hand. And then something happens to him, which I'll get into my theories on that, and he jumps off the bed, and he starts making his way to the door to get help. And he transfers the cigarette from his right hand to his left hand so he can use his right hand to turn the doorknob and open the door to safety. But he doesn't make it. He falls to his knees and he falls to the ground, and his cigarette's still in his fingers, and he dies. And Apple's like, you know what? That's pretty good. It makes a lot of sense. But the crucial missing piece here is, well, what was the trauma he suffered that caused him to jump from his bed and run to the door and then ultimately die? Ken's like, I got a theory on that too, but I got to be in the hotel room to see if it's true. So Apple and Ken go back to the hotel room. When they get there, Ken goes inside and he starts walking around, looking at the ceiling, the wall, the ground. And then finally he stops when he's looking back towards the front door leading back into the hall. And he points at the wall and he says, there. And Apple looks at what he's pointing at, and it looks like there had been some patchwork on the wall in the same spot where the doorknob, when it swings open, would hit the wall. And so Apple's looking at it and he's like, that's just from the doorknob. And so Ken takes the door and he opens it all the way to where the doorknob is pressed against the wall. And it's to the right of this patchwork, meaning this patchwork is not connected to the doorknob. Apple was confused and was about to ask questions, and Ken was like on a roll, and he said, hold on, and he goes outside, he goes next door to room 349, they go inside, and Apple walks in the room, and he's watching Ken do his work, and Ken's rubbing his hands all over the wall, and eventually he stops, and he looks up at Apple, and he takes his finger, and he pushes on one spot in the wall as Apple is watching, and his finger goes right in. And what he pushed on was this little chunk of toothpaste that had been wedged in this little tiny hole in the wall, and he pushed it through. Apple brought in a crime scene investigations unit who carefully excavated both sides of this wall, and they shined a laser from 349 into Greg's room, and the trajectory of the laser going through this hole lined up perfectly with where Greg would have been sitting on the bed, smoking cigarettes, eating candy, watching a movie. So Ken and Apple go back to the medical examiner, Dr. Brown, and they say, look, you missed something because Greg got shot. And unfortunately, Greg's body had already been cremated, but they did have the pictures to look at from the autopsy. And sure enough, they find that little tiny laceration in his crotch was actually an entrance wound. And then when Dr. Brown pointed out there was a hole in the heart, and it kind of lined up with the trajectory that bullet would have been traveling through his body, Dr. Brown realized he had made a mistake and he changed the autopsy report to reflect a gunshot wound. Ken and Detective Apple re-interviewed one of the electricians that had been in room 349 that was in the room where the gunshot had originated from. His name was Lance. And when they brought him in, they said, this is totally routine. You know, it's been 7+ months since Greg's death. And what we're doing is any of our witnesses, we want them to sign a statement, basically attesting that this is what I saw or didn't see. And so they had prepared a statement that basically lined up with the first thing he had told police, which was, I didn't hear anything, I didn't see anything. And they said, is there anything you want to change about your story? Or is this exactly what you saw and heard? And Lance said, yeah, that's exactly, I don't know anything. I wish I knew more, I'm sorry. And like, all right, well then can you sign this document saying that you don't know anything and you didn't see anything? And he said, yeah. He signs the document, and then Ken's like, all right, gotcha, because we know a gunshot was fired from your room and that's what killed Greg. And so you need to tell me who shot the gun. Otherwise, I'm taking you to jail for submitting a false police report. At this point, Lance crumbles and the truth comes out. And he said that he and the other electrician in the room with him, whose name was Muller, they were goofing around and drinking that night, and Muller went out and got his pistol from his car and he brought it in and he was goofing around with it. And Lance was saying that he was trying to get him to stop doing that, but he kept goofing around with the gun. And at one point, he aimed the gun at Lance, and Lance kind of batted it away from him. He dropped the gun, it landed, and it went off. And they saw where the bullet hole was. They saw it was into Greg's room, and they both froze and they listened to see if anybody had reacted to this gunshot. And he said they didn't hear anything for a long time, and that made them believe that no one was in the other room, that no one was in Greg's room, and that they were in the clear. And so they left and went to the bar. They didn't even think to check on whoever was in that room. And when they came back, they said they heard Greg coughing in his room, and that further confirmed that he must not have been in there when they fired the shot, and he's totally fine and they are totally in the clear. The next day, Lance said when they saw his body being taken out, at first they did think, oh my goodness, this is us. We did this. But they overheard Detective Apple walking around interviewing people saying out loud that, yeah, we think this is natural causes. Yep, looks like a heart attack. This is probably nothing. I'm sure it's nothing. And they were like, oh, phew, it's not us. And so they actually believed it was just a coincidence that on the same day they're firing a rogue bullet into Greg's room, that Greg had a heart attack and died separately. But Lance would say that somewhere in the back of both of their minds, they knew they probably had something to do with it. And so they covered their tracks, and they put toothpaste in the wall to cover up the hole, and they hid the gun, and they intentionally kept information from the police. And so ultimately Muller, the owner of the gun, the one who really instigated that night, waving the gun around, and the one who actually dropped the gun, he was charged with manslaughter and was given 10 years